And hello, everybody. Today I am with a very special guest, Mr. Dylan Roos. How you doing today, Dylan?
I'm good, thank you, man. How are you?
Doing fantastic. And I'm totally excited to have you on because after I met you at the training, the coaches NLP training, I started to get a lot of social media feeds. Maybe they're tracking and listening to what's going on around me or whatever. But I started getting a lot of like social media posts about the state of men, I would say, and I started hearing like lots of statistics that were concerning. Obviously things like men are more likely to have depression certain times. I mean, all these other things. And you know, it's interesting to hear that there's somebody out there coaching men nowadays, especially with this situation where it's people are very openly I don't want to say hating men, but I guess putting down this idea of what it means to be a man, or they frame it as like toxic masculinity or whatever.
Yeah.
And I know you're from you grew up in Australia, correct?
Oh, sorry, mate. You just broke up.
You grew up in Australia, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, grew up in Australia, and spent my whole life there. Basically, I've only just moved over to the States in the last 2 years or so.
Yeah. So is
Yep.
this a similar situation? I mean, you're in America and you also live in Australia,
Yep.
or you grew up in Australia. Is this a similar situation that's happening that you're noticing?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I
Cultural?
think I think over the past 20 years, the main narrative surrounding masculinity and the main narrative surrounding men has been masculinity is toxic, men are bad. I think that has been a massive uh, aspect of the messaging that has been delivered to society, but also to young boys and young men, is that they need to uh, be ashamed of their masculinity. They need to change their masculinity, fix their masculinity. And so it's definitely bigger in America, the conversation, but it's still a very large conversation in Australia, and definitely something that I didn't notice until I probably got to 18. So maybe in the last 10 years is when I started to really notice it, tune into the conversation. I started working with men about 5 years ago, so I became hyper aware of the masculinity space, and so yeah, it's really disappointing. It's really sad to see that be the main messaging surrounding men, and masculinity, but it's also a big reason as to why I do the work that I do and why I'm so passionate about helping young boys turn into heart-led, resilient young men.
Yeah, and when I heard of the I guess the title of your practice, Princes to Kings, I thought that was absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
So, backtracking a little bit, ultimately you said about 5 years ago is when you started working with men
Yeah.
and helping to coach them. What was there like something that got you inspired, or was there a moment that happened with you that made you do it? Or
Yeah, so I was dating a yoga instructor at the time, and she would host these monthly yoga events where it was like a breakfast yoga meditation. And I would go to them to support her, and I realized that there was no men going to these things. It'd be a room full of 60 people, and 58 of them would be women, and it'd be me and one other guy maybe there. And so upon noticing that, I kind of started to question, well, why aren't men taking better care of themselves? Why aren't we doing these things, such as yoga, that are really beneficial to our physical health, our mental health? And so, with that, my father and I started the first business in the men's space, which was the Roos Men's Wellness and Leadership Club. And that's where we challenged CEOs, leaders, managers in Melbourne to really work on their wellness habits and look at themselves in the mirror and say, can I be doing things that are better for my health? So our first event was a 60 guy breakfast where we did yoga, meditation, a breakfast, and then we had a couple business speakers. So that was kind of the hook, was the business and the networking, and then we tried to shove wellness down their throats as best we could. So we did about 5 events before COVID hit. We sold out 5 events, then COVID hit, and then government restrictions took over Australia, so the event space basically shut down. And that was my first taste in the men's space, and In 2019, after about 4 or so of the events, I had another mate of mine reach out and say, "Hey, mate, I'd love to do some more work in the men's space." So, me and two other guys, we jumped on a call, decided that we were going to do more work in the space, started another company, ran 2 events before COVID hit, and then we transitioned our business online, and continued that business. And that was a similar model. For the event space, and then we created a 10-week mentorship for men in 2020, and from there, in October 2020 is when I launched my program, Prince to King, working with young boys 14 to 23 and really helping them in their journey, as young boys transitioning into young men, but their mental health, emotional intelligence, resilience, leadership, confidence, all these things, I touch on in the program. And so I just love the space. I love working with men. It's one of the best things ever, just to see guys start to open up, drop down the walls, but also just improve their lives. It's such a great, uh, powerful thing to witness, is men. And now for the work that I'm doing now is all in my Prince to King program. That's really powerful, just to see these young boys, 14, as young as 14, 13, making these really big changes to their lives, where they come in, they're not really sure um, what it is that they need to change, and they're not really sure how to change, but they're really keen to change. And so it's really cool to see that process happen over a relatively short period of time, 12 weeks.
Yeah. And what I think is great about that is, in my mind, with everything that's been going on about, the negative uh, aura around masculinity and that topic, I can only see that in a sense growing. And at the same time, I think it's very necessary to be able to speak to these young men that you're working with, and to be able to tell them, like, hey, it's okay to reach out for help, and for not just help, but for coaching and
Yep.
self-improvement. So that's a wonderful thing. And it's you typically the does it typically come with, like, the parents, or do they is it
So I usually target parents. That's like my marketing, I guess you would say. And who I speak to most of the time is to parents. Parent reaches out to me. Dylan, love what you're talking about. Would love to chat to them, talk to them about my program, and then I jump on a call with the boys, chat to them, break the ice, crack a few jokes. Make it really clear that I'm not a counselor, I'm not a teacher, I'm not an uncle. I'm a mentor, I'm a coach, I'm someone outside the family that's going to come in, challenge them, but also support them in their goals.
Yeah, great, thank you. And on top of that, so what do you find is, or what do you believe to be the current biggest challenges that people within that age group are facing nowadays? Or what are you finding amongst
Hmm.
yeah.
I think there's two things. I think resilience is a big struggle for them. And the way that I look at it is it's pretty closely tied to vulnerability, those two things. And then the second or the third thing that I see them struggling with is this idea of masculinity being interwoven into their lives, into their psyche, and they're struggling really with how to manifest their masculinity and how to show up as men in today's society. And that's something that they really struggle with. And I think, we can dive into that if you'd like, but there's
Yeah,
so many reasons as to why I think that young boys are struggling with their masculinity. I think um, one reason has been the messaging outside the family home, which is masculinity is toxic, and you need to change, and there's something wrong with you. I think that plays a massive part in the messaging, and I'm really grateful that I didn't grow up with that heavy messaging. Now it is so heavy, it's everywhere. And then on the other side too, it's there's such an interesting time now with social media, where you can look out into the world and find someone online and then start to follow them, and then they'll give you advice, but you don't really know too much about that person, or you're not sure what's going on behind closed doors. And what social media rewards is pretty shallow values, right? So it rewards girls showing as much skin in it as they can. It rewards guys who make as much money and can post with cars and big houses and say ridiculous things online. It rewards ridiculousness. And so now you've got a bunch of social media influencers and role models who are not very good role models as well. So it's kind of a combination of the poor messaging surrounding masculinity, as well as just poor role models out in the world. You know, you look at some of the biggest influencers, the Paul brothers, for example, Jake and Logan Paul. They're fucking idiots. They're really bad role models, and they're morons. And then you look at how women are showing up online as well. It's women objectifying themselves and then asking men not to objectify them. And it's a really strange scenario where they're posting bikini photos 24/7 in order to get likes and to get followers. But if I'm a man and I happen to look at it, then I'm in trouble for doing that, or I'm a pervert, or there's something wrong with me, or grow, whatever it is. And so the messaging towards men has never been more confusing, right? If you go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, whilst we've progressed in society, and whilst a lot of that progression has been positive, there's still things that we have to look at and go, well, what have we left behind? What has been the negative effects of progression, if there are any? And I would say that there are. And one of the things is there was really clear roles, right? These traditional gender roles, as people call it today, back 50 years ago, they actually helped people orientate their lives and sort out their lives, right? Okay, what's my role as a man? Okay, well, I know what my role as a man. My role is to provide, to protect, and preside. Okay, great. Now I know that I can fulfill that. And when I fulfill my role, I feel good about myself and I feel good about the family that I'm raising. And that's going to lead to elevated levels of mental well-being. Now you don't have a very strong structure for what a man looks like. And it was interesting. I was listening to a panel discussion maybe 2 months ago, and even they were saying like, oh, like and it was all around masculinity in men, and they couldn't put to words what it means to be a man. Like they don't want to put it, because it's just immediately considered a man box, or like, oh, well, what happens if you fit outside of that? Like, what happens to you then? What about these minorities, right? And so the more time I've spent in this space, the more I think it's actually important to give structure to what works. And so this plays into my point around, well, who is talking about what works, right? Like if you've got one guy over here saying do this and another guy saying the opposite, who do you listen to? And so what I try my best to do with my work is kind of get all my skeletons out of the closet. I'm like, here's all my fuck ups, here's all my mistakes, here's all the things that I did wrong in my life. And here's how I'm going now. Here's what I did to rectify those decisions. Here's how those decisions. So I try to be as open and vulnerable as I can about my life so that people can kind of make their own decisions. But also, I'm trying to live in alignment with my values and show that, hey, you can be a good person, a heart-led man, a vulnerable man, and resilient and successful and all these things. And that's the role modeling that I'm trying to portray, and that requires structure. So because then I give my advice, or I explain, here's my idea of what it means to be a man. Here's where I think you'll naturally thrive, where you're not going against your biological desires, or Carl Jung talks about the collective unconscious, which is this idea that men and women have a collective unconscious psyche that drives our behaviors. And so the king archetype is one of the main four archetypes. You've got the warrior, the king, the lover, and the magician. And these are four archetypes which are a part of the collective unconscious. So all men, or a very, very high majority of men, will be driven by these archetypes. And I would actually correct myself and say all men have these archetypes, and then women have their archetypes as well. And so I think we've wanted to destroy as much structure and as much boxes as we can, but now we've left the next generation going, hey, how do I become a man? And we're like, well, it's whatever you want it to be. And it's like, no, that's actually really bad advice. You need to give kids, teenagers, structures and blueprints and models for them to fit into the world so that then they can best navigate that world. Now, okay, maybe my advice works for 80, 90, 95% of people. What about the 5%, Dylan? That if you're the 5%, you just have to work harder to find your own identity as a man. No one,
What do you
it's
mean
not
by the 5%?
well,
What would
okay.
that be?
So a lot of what I talk about would be things like, okay, you need to be a leader, you need to be resilient, you need to be able to tap into your heart, and as a man, you need to be able to lead your family. As a man, you need to be able to protect. As a man, you need to be able to be courteous and genuine and all these things, right? And for me, I'm like, that is a pretty good blueprint. If people followed those values, those are pretty good values, right? Now, for someone, okay, if for someone that fits outside of those values, maybe there is a quiet introverted kid who doesn't want to um make a lot of money, doesn't want to lead in the community or develop himself, and maybe this kid is really happy, and the keyword is happy and meaningful, those two words. As long as he's finding meaning in his own life and is relatively happy most of the time, then he can, I'm like, go and fit into whatever version of man you think best suits you. However, what I would challenge that young person on is, have you really attempted to do the difficult things that you know are necessary in your life that you have to do? Are you developing yourself? And the big question is, are you actually happy on the path that you're on? Are you actually finding meaning in your life? Because without those two things, then I can't exactly say, well, how the way that you're living your life is the way that you should be. Because if you're unhappy and you don't have any meaning, well, then it's like, well, you're probably making some mistakes. So that's kind of where I think if we can give structure uh and guidance to the popul to the populace, to the society, and then if you feel like that doesn't work for you, that's okay. You've at least you've got a starting point of structure to then go, well, I like these things about this structure. However, I actually feel like I don't mind painting my nails as a man. That I don't think that affects my masculinity, and I'm happy doing that. And I'm going to paint my nails and put on eyeliner, and I'm going to go out, and I still think I'm a man. Great, as long as you're happy and chasing meaning, that's fine. Would I give that advice like, hey guys, you need to tap into your masculinity by painting your nails and doing it? No, I would not, because it's not going to apply to 80, 90, 95% of the boys that I'm working with, but just the general population of men. And so I think we're very scared now to give structure and to say um like generalities. You know, you see on social media all the time, someone will make a post saying men need to be leaders, right? And then someone will contact, why do men need to be leaders? Why are you putting this pressure on men? Like, wow, why don't you think about it? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, for the majority of men, they're going to feel better about themselves. They're going to live happier lives and more meaningful lives, the majority, if they are leaders, and however they define that leadership, right? So again, we live in a world where we're trying to speak to the majority, but we have a minority in a lot of cases that want to speak up and say, well, because that doesn't apply to me, it shouldn't apply to anyone else. And I just think that's dangerous for the majority of people who would actually find that their lives would drastically improve if they did have structure, if they did have a blueprint to what it means to be a man and what healthy masculinity looks like.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point you just brought up, which I never really noticed before. This idea that, there is a very vocal group that is, as you might say, outside the box. And, it's very easy to get lost on social media. I mean, even as a adult, I listen to some of these kids, I'm like, wow, they're so angry,
Yeah.
and, there's very few kids between ages of 13 to 23 that I see on like social media, men, boys, whatever, young men, talking about, hey, this is what I'm doing to be the best man possible. But you do see a lot of people talking about like, hey, well, don't put me in this box or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that's really
Hey,
interesting.
yeah. And I think what we've done is we've destroyed the structures that we had in place for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, depending on what structures you're talking about, but we've had a lot of structures in society that we've demolished in the last 20 years in the name of progression, but we haven't built anything to replace it. So there's no, it's just a kind of a barren wasteland, and it's like good luck finding yourself, and no matter what you find, it's okay with what you find. And I'm like, well, that's dangerous, because that's not a good mentality to build a life and to build an identity around, because now you can just justify being an overweight, unhealthy smoker who vapes, plays PlayStation for 6 hours a day, and that's okay because that's your identity. And that's, no, it's not. That is not okay. You should be healthy. That you should be healthy. We can't even call people fat anymore, right? Like,
Right.
and we
Yeah.
and we think these things aren't a big deal, right? We're like, Dylan, what's a big deal? Can't we just be nice to people? It's like, you can be both, but I would argue that by society holding people accountable to healthy standards of saying, hey man, like, you need to get into the gym and work out, and you need to change your diet, you need to, that's, I'm being nicer to you, delivering that message, than the person who's saying, hey, you're fine the way that you are, stay, don't worry about the fat shamers, right? So we can't find, and this is where America's way worse than Australia. It's so hard to find common ground across the pond when you've got differing opinions on things, right? Again, in America, you got the left and the right, and once you start to align with two or three things on one of those sides, all of a sudden you have to align with everything that side believes in, and then it becomes a battleground. And so it's just really interesting that we can't give any structure to people without it coming across as phobic to another group of people, right? It's just this really interesting time that we live in right now, where
Question.
yeah,
Yeah. Go. You can finish the thought, but just a question.
no, you go. I was done.
So earlier you discussed how some of the challenges that the people that you're coaching are having. How about, the parents? Like, what are they dealing with? Like, what are they thinking about when they're like, hey, I'd love for my kid to go from prince to king?
Yeah. A lot of it is mental health. So, like depression, anxiety, low confidence, low self esteem, poor communication skills, quick to anger. Those are really common things that I'm seeing. But the the thing that I'm seeing that's on the rise is the boy who can't operate in society. So it's not a majority of percentage, but the percentage is definitely growing over the last 2 years. I'm like, oh wow, more and more boys are coming to work with me from a really poor starting place. And what I mean by that is, okay, my son's not going to school, and he I can't get him to go to school. I'm like, and what does he do? He stays up till 3 a.m. on YouTube or Netflix or PlayStation, and then he sleeps until 12 or 1, and then he wakes up, he doesn't exercise, he doesn't eat well, like really helpless boys. That percentage is growing a lot. Even at like 20, 21, 22, I had a boy that I was working with some time ago where he couldn't order his own food at a takeaway shop. He had to get his mum to go in and do it for him, right? And so that is what I'm noticing. That percentage of boys, which might have been 1% of boys, is, or less than 1%, is now growing steadily to the point where we n- now see a majority of men act out in what I call the Peter Pan syndrome. And Jordan Peterson has talked about this, and I really like the Peter Pan syndrome. It's these boys that never want to grow up, right? They stay at home, they stay playing PlayStation, they don't exercise, they don't get girlfriends, they don't move out, they don't find a career, they don't get jobs, they don't develop themselves in any way, and they just want to stay boys, and they just want to enjoy the freedom and the zero responsibility lifestyle that boys live, and they don't want to become men. And that is a massive problem that I do see 20 to 30 to 35 to 40-year-old, 20 to 45, that age range where you should be developing yourself and growing up. People just aren't doing it anymore, or boys aren't doing it anymore. Women are now outperforming men at college level, university level, in the workplace now. High school, primary school, women are outperforming men in a lot of areas now. And that's not to say that they shouldn't be doing it, but men should be stepping up more. That it's more about the men. Why aren't men stepping up?
Yeah, and it definitely sounds like just based on these trends, this situation is only this disparity can only grow
Yeah.
unless something is done, I guess, on a societal level. Um, and I guess I make it sound overly like drastic on societal level, but I think there can be a huge problem, in the future. And then on the other hand, I see a lot from different social media influencers talking about what it means for modern dating online, and
Yeah.
things like that, and how just a certain very small percentage of men are, doing online dating or getting, a huge
Yeah.
proportion of the dates and everything. So is that a topic that comes up pretty often, like the dating life? Or is it more about just leadership and things
It,
like that?
it doesn't come up too much in my work with the boys. And I think a part of that is it's one of the more difficult things for men to talk about, even with close friends, is like their dating life and how they're going with girls and when they get rejected. Like very few men have the confidence to talk openly about their dating life with other men. I think it's really important that they do. I just think it's really rare. So it doesn't come up too much in my work, but I'm very aware of what you're referring to in terms of now for the first time ever. Oh, what's the statistic? But boys just aren't having sex. So it's like, oh, I don't want to make up a statistic, but it's a large percentage of boys haven't had sex in the last 12 months from 18 to 25, which is the first time ever this has kind of been a problem. And it's an interesting conversation because I don't want to talk about it necessarily from the morality standpoint of should they be having sex, but I more look at it as they want to be having sex and they're not. And that's a problem because if you're unable to fulfill the desires that you have and important desires that you have, and you're unable to, you become bitter and resentful and weak. And those men become the most dangerous to society. The boys and the men who start to then hate women because women are rejecting them and they don't understand women and all these things. They become the most dangerous men to society because they become so bitter and resentful towards the opposite sex and then towards themselves and then towards everyone that it's really not a good recipe. And so what's happened now is you've got, yeah, 1%, 10% of men getting majority of the women and 90% of men getting zero or very few women. And that is an issue because the 90% become very angry and very um they become victims to society, right? They're like, oh, the world's unfair. Oh, women treat me like this, right? They get angry and then they attack and they lash out. So it is an issue, and again, to the social media point, there's so much bad advice out there, even like, especially in the dating world. You've got the red pill community, which are you familiar with the red pill community or the red pillars?
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So that's kind of
Yeah.
this
Very
idea.
toxic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. They're very much like yeah, like, some of the shit I see, it's like stay toxic king and like toxic traits and all it's like it's really, really dumb. And it was born out of this idea that men should be valued. So it was born out of a good idea, but it's kind of the male's version. How this is how I view it. It's kind of the male's version of feminism, right? So feminism was kind of born out of this idea that women deserve equal rights. Well, 100% agree, can definitely get on board. And then now that we're in the 21st century, 2022, there are zero rights that men get that women don't also get. And so now the feminist movement, and I think they call it the third wave feminism, has turned into this men hating community. And I see the red pill community as the equivalent on the men's side. It's like it started off with like, hey men, you need to value yourselves. And now it's kind of turned into this like women hating side of the internet. And so I don't align with that either. But so it's interesting because the advice that they're giving is really fucking bad for men because it's basically saying treat women really poorly, don't respect them, and a lot of other uh, poor ideas for a relationship that we want to have. Even when I get on podcasts and when I talk about my work publicly, I'm trying my best to not cause more of a divide. I'm trying my best to go, how do we come together? Because the sexes are really at each other. I can only speak from my timeline, but from what I speak to my parents and my grandparents' generation, this is kind of the most the sexes have been at each other I think, for a long time we got along, and that's what allowed us to develop the society that we have today. But now we're just always at each other's throats. So I try to, and I'm sure I make mistakes along the way, but I try my best to kind of bring them together and say, how can we come together? And I don't see the red pill doing that, and I don't see feminism doing that either. And I see they're kind of two sides of, or two ends of the balancing beam.
Yeah, that is an interesting way of saying it. I could definitely see how they're very very super opposite poles for sure.
Mm, mm.
Um, all right, okay, and so this is probably a good time to hear about your take on, what is the extent of masculinity before it becomes too toxic? Like, where's that? Where's that
Well, I
bridge
think
or gap?
so. I don't use the term toxic masculinity in my work, and I speak pretty openly about not using it in my vocabulary and encouraging people to question the use of it in theirs or to stop using it in theirs. And there's a few reasons for that. And one reason is toxic. So when you think of something that is toxic, right, you think of you have to wear a biohazard suit and you're in the Simpsons power plant and you're moving like plutonium and it's toxic. You can't touch it, stay away from it. It needs to be put in a special place where it can't hurt anyone. When you apply that logic to a psyche or a part of yourself, it like there's nothing in my psyche or a part of myself, even the shadow side of myself or the quote unquote negative or bad parts of me, they're not toxic. They're things that I need to actually face and address. And so I can't do anything that's toxic about masculinity. I can't do something with that. I have to put it in a corner and ignore it. And we know, put something in the corner, you ignore it, it festers, it gets worse and worse and worse, and then it kills you or it becomes a massive problem. So I don't use it for that reason. So I use wounded masculinity because what can I do with wounds? Well, I can heal my wounds. I can address my wounds. I can face them and work on myself. So that's one reason. The second reason I don't use it is um, the majority of men, and as I said, I've been in this space for 5 years. So I like to think I'm pretty good at seeing the benefit of the doubt of the other side's conversation. I get that toxic masculinity was born out of this idea of holding men accountable to higher standards. I get that. I'm not an idiot. I understand that that was why it was born. But again, now it's kind of shifted to where if you were to have a really honest conversation with 90% of men and you start to bring up toxic masculinity, there's this checking out of from the men. There's this kind of like, oh, fucking toxic masculinity, here we go. Like, what are you going to say now about men? Right. And I've been in this space for 5 years. And even I get a little bit of that depending on who I'm speaking to. I'm like, oh, here we go. The patriarchy, toxic masculinity. All right. What, like, what? So if we need men in the conversation, we need men in this conversation of holding other men accountable to high standards. We have to have men in that conversation, and the word that you're using to bring men in immediately checks out 90% of men, then it's not a good solution. It's just logically not something that you want to be using. So when I use the term wounded masculinity, most people be like, oh, what's that? Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard of that. Or if I'm using it in a more deliberate context, the men lean into the conversation and they want to heal or they want to address it or they want to be held accountable. And so that's a massive reason too as to why I don't use it, is because I want the boys in my clients, I want them involved in this conversation of, hey, you can be a better version of what of yourself. Hey, this kind of behavior, this kind of rhetoric, this kind of thought process, that's not good. But let's explore why. Let's explore what the opposite is. Let's have a nuanced conversation because it requires that. And then the third reason I don't use it is because you and I could probably have a conversation if you said it in conversation and you and I one on one can get to the bottom of what you mean by toxic masculinity. And I might agree with you. And I'd be like, yeah, that's a pretty valid explanation of what I think toxic masculinity is too. But again, we live in this social media world where now everyone can say this word and there's no one knows what anyone means by it. There's kind of an assumed meaning behind it. So unless I can have a one-on-one conversation with someone and get to the bottom of what they mean by it, explore what they mean by it, how they came to those conclusions, it just becomes too difficult a word to throw around and to use publicly. And so that's also why I don't use it, is because one person could say it and I could completely disagree wholeheartedly with what they said. I was on an interview months and months and months ago now, and a guy said that kept using toxic masculinity, and then he said there's nothing positive about masculinity. So those kind of people, it's very difficult for me to engage in that conversation because we're starting at a point of there's nothing positive about masculinity. So I can't, and he will attribute that when he uses toxic masculinity. That's what he means by that. He means everything about masculinity is toxic. So, and I think a lot of men, rightly or wrongly, attribute that meaning to that word. Again, rightly or wrongly, you could make an argument saying men need to just get over it, but I'd rather just not take the route of most resistance, and I'd rather take the route of least resistance and say, well, if I just change my word from toxic masculinity to wounded disarms a lot of men and brings them into the conversation. So why would I not do that instead of using this word that's now been weaponized against men? And I think, again, if you speak to a lot of men, I feel like if they're really honest, no one's listening, no one's going to cancel them. I think a lot of men would be like, yeah, I actually fucking hate that word. I really don't like toxic masculinity. I think it's an attack on men. I think a lot of men in an honest conversation would agree with that.
Yeah, totally. And that's great that you're able to reveal this the significance of how that is affecting all of us, that word. I've seriously never thought of it. I mean, obviously I don't like the word, but like just to really think of it on that deep of level of how
Yeah.
it is being weaponized. And at some level, like specifically what you were saying about that experience that you had with that guy who, thinks everything masculine is toxic, just to think that there's that, and then there's everything else in between. That could really get confusing, and it just like totally
Yeah.
makes everything even more like, well, what do I do now, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, and you see this, it's not an outlier in society today. Like um, you see these words that become weapons, or these words that a lot of people use, but could have um, a very broad definition, right? Like I could say, hey, I'm conservative in my values, and someone might be like, oh, okay, he is a he's a family man who wants a couple kids and a dog, and he wants to pay low taxes. Another person might hear conservative and think, oh, so you're a racist and a homophobe, right? So it's not just in the masculinity space, it's kind of across all of society now, where we have these buzzwords where we use them very often, but we don't have enough of this. We don't have enough of one-on-one. When you say you're conservative, or you say you're Democrat, what are the policies that align on that side? Or like we don't do that anymore. We just go, oh, you're Democrat. Okay, so you must think that kids need to be gay, and whatever some highly conservative person would think of a Democrat, right? Like we have
Right.
all these preconceived notions. So it's not just in the masculinity space. It's everywhere now. It's everywhere.
Yeah, that's huge for sure. And with that said, so you have a kid now, right?
Yep, little 5 month old.
Little 5 month old.
Yep.
So, prior to, so it's 5 months old, you started this 5 years ago.
Yep.
Do you think how do you think this is going to, I mean, are you going to hire a coach, or do you think for your child that you like have the answers? Like how does that work?
I think there's always going to be a time in every young boy's life where they stop listening to their parents. And it happens to all of us. And I think the big driver of that is we're boys and we grow up, and then we're like, oh, I want to become a man now. Okay, and a man is autonomous and makes his own decision. I think again, the collective unconscious that we have, that we just know, we're like, a man makes his own decisions. And so we stop listening to mum and dad because they're giving us advice, and we don't want to do, and we don't want to follow what someone else is saying in our family. We want to make our own path. And so when my son gets to 13, 14, and I start to notice there's more friction, there are things that I'm going to do that are going to support him. I'm going to bring in outside mentors. I'm going to take him on a rites of passive journey, and I'm going to say, okay, it will take some discernment for me, but it'll be about 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there, where I go, all right, you want to be a man? Let's go. And I'm going to get my dad, I'm going to get my brother, I'm going to get a couple of my mates and a couple of mentors, and I'm going to go and I'm going to take him through a rites of passage journey, because that's what societies did all over the world for thousands of years when boys were becoming men. And that's because women are born and men are made. Okay, women naturally they go through their periods when they hit puberty, and that's kind of a very coming of age. They see blood. It's a coming of age into womanhood moment, right? There is no equivalent for boys. So what they used to do was rites of passage. The elders of the
Agoge,
tribes, pardon?
Spartan Agogis. I
Yeah,
think it's Agoge.
Spartanagogis. Yep, Spartanagogis. But all these different societies who had no contact with each other all developed the same thing. They all realized, fuck, boys who don't grow into men are an issue. That's a problem. Okay, we need to help our boys become men. And they would take them away. They do bloodletting, they do rituals. You'd go kill a lion or something, like you do these things that now you are a man. And then you were greeted by the rest of the tribe as a man, and then you developed a different relationship with your mum. You left. Some cultures didn't. Some cultures would have the boys not speak to their mum for 2 years and then get reinitiated into the tribe, and they would have a completely different relationship because boys and their mothers need to change their relationship from this kind of mum taking care of boy to, all right, I'm now your peer, and now we're taking care of, I'm going to take care of you. So that's what I'll do. And I'm really looking forward to it. Like, I just know that no matter how great of a parent I am, I need outside support. I need a tribe around me. I just know that. And I know that I'm really grateful because of the work that I do. But I just know that my dad was a professional athlete, professional coach, the best coach in Australia for the sport. He was my dad. When I got to 14, I stopped listening to him. Right. I just stopped listening to him. Now, do I wish I could go back in time and smack my 14-year-old self in the head and say, hey, listen to your dad? Absolutely. But you can't put an old head on young shoulders. So that's kind of the importance of coaches, mentors, the tribe, the rites of passage in taking boys into manhood. Because you look at when did you know you were a man?
That's a tough question. I mean, there were just like these moments where I'm like, am I growing up now? But I was
Mm,
never like, hey, this is it.
yeah.
This is the threshold that you crossed.
Same, man. I said I lived my life 26 years as a boy, 27 years as a boy, and I took myself through my own initiation process and said, all right, you're a man now. And I did it a couple times and I had these things, but we don't have it now. If you ask most guys, it might be like, oh, when I had my first beer, or when I lost my virginity, or when I got my license, or when I turned 18, or in America, when I turned 21. It's like they're pseudo rituals. There are no rituals now that go, you are a man, act like it, behave like it. From this day forward, you want to be a man, you are one now. Here's what it means to be one. We don't have it. And then we look around and we look out into the world and we say, why are all these man childs running around? Why are all these Peter Pans here? Why are men struggling so much with their identity? One thing that I've had to kind of, and, and I'm still journaling on it and addressing it internally, but this idea that men are suiciding because they don't talk about their emotions. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's why, because the last 20 years has been talk about your emotions, go to therapy, talk to emotions, talk about therapy. And so we've increased our emotional intelligence as men. We've increased going to therapy. We've increased talking about our emotions, and suicides have increased as well. So we're not, if we had said 20 years ago when the conversation started, it's because men aren't opening up, and then we did, and then the suicide rates dropped, I would have said, cool, that makes sense. But I actually think what is causing a lot of men to suicide is a lack of purpose, a lack of identity, a lack of initiation into manhood. I think those are the big things that are actually really drastically affecting men. And that is the reason why you see us killing ourselves in the highest number ever, ever. So I actually don't think it's got anything to do with opening up more. I think it's got more to do with finding purpose. I think we definitely are. I'm going to kind of contradict myself a little bit right now. We are the least connected society of all time. So in the 1970s, they did a study out of Harvard where the average American had, I think it was 3.2 close friends. They then did it again in 2010, and the average American has 0.9 close friends. So the average American has no close friends. So we definitely have lost connection as well. And I do think that also plays a massive role in the suicide rates rising as well. So I think it's a combination of those things that are really causing it. So we need to bring back these rites of passage. We need to bring back structures, and here's what it means to be a man, and this is where you need to excel in, and this is what you need to do, and you need to order yourself and get your life together and work on yourself and build yourself up, and then you will be happier, and then you will find more meaning.
Yeah, that is powerful. And this idea of this rites of passage. So as a just curious, like to get a bonus from you, some bonus ideas. Um, I know in the Jewish community they have like bar mitzvahs,
Yep.
and I think a military is a very I would consider that almost, I mean, basically it is a rites of passage. You go from like, but even after you've gone through boot camp and stuff, you're still like, there's a lot of immaturity there. But, that aside, besides these like big events that are already here, what are, for a parent listening to this, what are some ideas of like a rite of passage that, a parent could potentially do for their kid? What are a couple of examples for like,
Yep.
a kid who doesn't do sports and isn't the most social, but something that their parent could do with their son.
Yeah, so I mean, for those that are able to, there are companies that run rites of passage programs. So they are what's the word? They are blanking on the word. Someone to change the word. They're detailed programs that have been put together specifically to take boys to men. So if you can do that and find that, just Google rites of passage and whatever area you're in, do that. Highly recommend that. It's actually something that I really want to step into in the next 1 to 2 years, is running 2 or 3 of rites of passage programs. Other than that, if you're a dad, or if you're an uncle or a part of a young boy's life where you are the male role model, you need to take him out somewhere away. Leave the phones, leave the computers, leave the technology, go on a 2-day camping trip, go somewhere in the wilderness into nature, connect with your son, talk to him about masculinity, talk to him about what it means to be a man, talk about your struggles, talk about where you overcame. Have him do something difficult, go for a run with him, or do some sort of initiation, dunk him in a river, like do some sort of initiation where he can say, when he gets older, oh, I became a man at 15 years old when dad and my uncle and 3 of his friends, they took me up into the woods, and we sat around a campfire for 2 days. They told stories, I listened, and then we went for a swim in the freezing cold lake for 5 minutes, and we came out, and the men all stood on the shore and said, welcome to manhood, and embraced me into manhood. And then the second important part to rites of passage is you then need to be accepted by the rest of the community, and there needs to be an acceptance and a shift of the way that you view your son or this young man coming back. So if you're talking very specifically of what I would do, is something like I just mentioned, and then coming home, I would have some sort of party. I would have some sort of ceremony. We've kind of stepped away. We think ceremonies are like girls who are into star signs, and like they do rituals and they light candles. It's like, no, actually, like ceremonies and rituals are really important. We have them when you graduate high school. You go to a graduation ceremony, and that signifies you're done with high school and you step out into the real world. And it's powerful. It's a powerful moment. I remember my graduation ceremony. I'll probably always remember it. It's a powerful thing. So I would then go and do this thing I'd get my brother, my dad, a few of my mates. I'd take my son out into the woods. I'd do some exercises. I'd do some rituals. I'd come back and I'd have my wife, and I'd have um, my aunties, my grandmas, I'd have all my uncles, I'd have everyone else there. And I would say, welcome back to the tribe. Welcome back. You are now a man. And as a result of that, I'm now going to treat you differently. And we are all going to treat you differently. We're going to treat you like a man now. We've been treating you like a boy. Now we're going to treat you like a man. And so I think they're the two components, is the actual rights and then the returning to the village.
Yeah, that is amazing. And I think the idea itself is super powerful. Just the idea of giving a moment of a parent saying to the kid, like, and like an actual event that happens, that now you're a man. I mean, that could have such huge impact on a kid.
Hmm.
Just walking into school the next day, I can already imagine, like, feeling like a man, with that kid, what it can mean for that kid. So,
Yeah.
or that boy or whatever. And at the same time, super powerful ideas that you've shared here. And, thank you for taking the time to talk about all this stuff, and to not just talk about it, but like dive in deep on these important topics. I mean, this is going to be definitely huge, especially now going into the future and everything. So with that, anything else?
Mate, I'll just finish on saying like yeah, something that I mentioned earlier, but just how do we come together? How do we accept each other truly for our differences and say, hey, we might be different, we might believe different things. However, I can see myself in you. I can see the humanity in you that I have in me. And how do we come together, whether it's man, female, gay, straight? How do we just come together and say we want to build a better society, we want to build better communities, we want to be better people. And I think the starting point is the internal reflection, looking inwards, facing your own shit, working on yourself. And that will never end. You will never stop that. There's no destination where you go, oh, I'm done working on myself. I've achieved it. Like it's you just continue to do that. And I think that would be my final message is just to get a coach, get a mentor, get a therapist, get a men's group. Like men's groups are so powerful for men, especially with how disconnected and lonely we are. Go to a workshop, a retreat, like get a book, listen to podcasts, do these things that you can improve your lives.
Yeah, that is absolutely amazing. And with that said, definitely a huge question that you ended with there. And how do we all come together? And I definitely think that somewhere down the road, when I invite you back on a podcast, you'll probably have some answers for that
I hope
at
so,
some
mate. I
level.
hope I hope so.
Some
I hope
answers that at
so.
least improve that in some way. So amazing. Thank you so much for being on here, Dylan. And also, for anybody who wants to, what would be the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, so Dylan Roos, Dyllanroos. If you put that into any social media platform, you'll find me. I'm everywhere: YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram. My website's dylanrooscoaching.com. You can find my email, you can send me a DM, whatever. I respond to everyone. So yeah, reach out to me if you want to chat, or yeah, if you just want to connect, then yeah, reach out, hit that follow button, and I hope that I can provide more value on those mediums.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening, everybody. Have a great day.